I'm here to talk about the lit review component of the dissertation or thesis, and sort of some tips to follow about writing the literature review, as well as just going about putting together a literature review. Things that I've learned from my experience, as well as from some of the sources that I've been able to gather throughout the years. And I've got a few of them here, and I put them on the PowerPoint. Actually, they're not on the PowerPoint version you have, so I'll send you an updated version. I'll send Jeannie an updated version so you have that. Because I did add a couple of things to the slide, which were some of the books that I was using, and they've been really helpful to me in my process as well. One that I don't have here is APA actually publishes a dissertations and theses from start to finish book, which I used to use when I was doing these types of workshops 10 years ago. I did the 93 version, the green version I used to have, but I ditched it a while back because it referred to old APA style, and so it was confusing. But they have a newer edition now, and it's probably as good as the other one was really good, so it's probably just as good. But I don't have that one here, but I would recommend it as well. But I do have a couple other books that I'll definitely turn you guys on to, as well as there's a lot of resources on the web as far as just getting helpful advice on pursuing writing a lit review. But really the best thing you can do is read other lit reviews, I think. That's really how I learned how to do it, especially when you're focusing on a particular discipline. There are expectations in the particular discipline, so reading lit reviews in your discipline is a good way to really get focused in on what the expectations are. And that was one of the reasons I had Jeannie include in the packet that you have a published lit review from a journal. Because lit reviews they're not just for breakfast anymore. They're not just for dissertations and theses, but they're also sometimes standalone journal articles. Because people want to know what is the current state of research in this particular area. It's something that people do want to know about, and so lit reviews do get published as journal articles. So, it's a possibility even that you might get the lit review section of your dissertation. It might be something you might shape into a journal article if you're interested in publication. And actually, we'll talk about using those as sources too, because I think sometimes when people start doing research into their dissertation topic and they find a lit review recent of exactly what they're doing, it makes you go, oh, I guess I can't do that now because somebody else has done it. Well, maybe somebody else has done it, but they haven't done it the way that you are going to do it. And so there are ways that you can use that work that somebody else has done, and certainly not copy it or plagiarize it, but use it as something to build off of, or to use as a way to sort of springboard you into sort of maybe a deeper focus in particular areas. So, all right, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so what is a lit review? A literature review. You're surveying scholarly articles, books, and other sources, and I'll talk about some of the specific sources, but that could be even other people's dissertations, it could be conference proceedings, but they're relevant to the particular issue or area of research or theory that you are focusing on, and you provide some sort of critical evaluation of that work, so that you're not just saying, such and such article said this, such and such article said that. You give a sense in your lit review that you actually read this article, and you understand the methodology, you understand what the conclusions were, you understand what the repercussions of those conclusions were, and maybe you even have some things to say about whether the method was sound, or whether the measurements were correct, or even those sorts of things. So you demonstrate that you know something about that area. What is your purpose? Your purpose is to, of course, give a sense of what is going on in your field at this time, so that your reader will have some background for what they're going into with your dissertation or your thesis. But it's also, as we know, it's also a way to demonstrate to your committee or your chair that you know what you're talking about before they even get into it. And that's a lot of times lit reviews will really trip students up, because chairs can be very demanding sometimes, and they expect you to really gain a very deep knowledge of the area, the ground that you're covering. And especially if you have a chair that knows a lot about your area, sometimes it can take some time to really get caught up to where you need to be. Yeah, it can be kind of challenging. I don't think it'll be as bad for you guys. I mean, knowing the faculty here, but I've had horror stories of people, it's taken them, extra years to finish dissertations and even master's thesis because their chair really, really knows a lot about this subject, and they just happen to pick that subject, and they're having to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and it seems to never end. So, but hopefully that won't happen to you guys, and you'll get out. You'll get out safely. I guess the trick there is don't pick anything your chair knows that much about. No, wait, that's on tape now, so I've said that. But that is an advantage. And you're supposed to demonstrate how your research, what you're going to go into, what's going to follow that if you're writing it as part of a dissertation or a thesis, how what you're doing fits into this larger scheme. What questions does it answer maybe that haven't been answered yet? I talk about later about sort of puzzle pieces that, journal articles and things provide, research provides little puzzle pieces. Any sort of problem is like a huge jigsaw puzzle. Nothing stands alone. And so research can only provide a little sliver, right? So what are you going to offer that's going to make that picture clearer to everyone? So to give them a sense of what you're going to offer, you have to sort of flesh out what is the picture so far, what's missing, or what questions still remain that you can provide. And again, it might be a standalone assignment and maybe even like a journal article on its own, but it's also a lot of times it's part of a dissertation or a thesis, sometimes it's even part of a grant proposal. I've done grant proposals that required somewhat of a lit review. Usually it's not as lengthy, but it is something that's sometimes expected. Getting started, problem formulation. Which topic or field is being examined and what are its component issues? And that's something that I hope when we come into this stage of the process, we have a sense of where we're going to go, what it is we're interested in, and we have a grasp, at least in general, of the subject area that we're going into. Once you have that, it's a good idea to go into it in some ways without a lot of preconceived notions. Of course, we all have preconceived notions. We think we know what we're going to find in our research. We have ideas and theories that we prefer, that we think are going to be fleshed out, or we hope they're going to be fleshed out. But it's also a good idea to sort of go into it with a pair of fresh eyes and just get, as sort of a sampling of what's out there, rather than just focusing maybe specifically on a specific theory that you have and how it applies in a particular situation. Just look at, what's going on in that field? What's going on right now in, psychiatric nursing? What's the research that's being done? And then maybe getting a broad sense and then starting to get contract more into more specific things that you're focusing on. So as I said, choose a variety of articles, even if they don't specifically answer what your research question is. You may find articles that loosely relate, but that's something that you would not necessarily find, if you were just sort of doing a Boolean search on the computer and put in the particular terms. You may find some things that are really, really helpful. I know I have in the past. Another way to do it, I don't have it on the PowerPoint, but another way that I like to sort of get a broad view of what's going on is that, find 3 or 4 or 5 articles that you think are interesting that are on that subject matter, and then look at their reference pages. What did they draw upon? And they'll have some preferred sources, and some of them will look interesting, and there's things that might not necessarily directly relate to your question, but they could be really interesting sources that could lead you down some interesting paths. So check out those reference pages and, check out some of those sources along the way. Once you've done that, you want to select the most relevant information from the articles. Remember, you're supposed to be showing how your research is going to fit into a larger field of study. So, you want to get a sense of, what are the important articles in the field. You want to get a sense of, what's the important information that's out there, what's the most current information out there. So you want to try to keep the past 2 semesters when I've done lit reviews, one of the things that I've tried to do is to keep my searches, at least initially, for articles in the past 5 years. I'll start from there. And then I'll go deeper if I notice that those articles are citing sources that are further back that we need for background information or for foundational information and move back from there. So you can sort of trace back where you need to go, how far back you need to go based on what they're giving you. Another thing that's interesting that I just discovered in the process of doing lit reviews is if you've ever used Google Scholar. Do any of you guys use Google Scholar? One of the cool features about that is that it lets you know, of course it doesn't look at everything, but it'll give you a little link there to show how many other sources cite that source. And that's always very enlightening too. You know, if you have an article and it's only cited by 3 people or it's not cited by anybody, maybe it's not that important of an article. But if you, and that doesn't mean it's bad, it just means it's not been found by a lot of people, which means it might be very useful to you. However, if you find an article that's been cited by 300 other articles or 500 other articles, that might be one you need to read, because that might be something that's really important that everybody's going to expect you to have seen, because it is popular in that field. The next step, I think, is one of the most important steps, and I actually expanded this in the presentation. So it's in the new version of the presentation, a few things that aren't in this one. But critically examine the articles, look at methodology, statistics, results, theoretical framework, purpose, including any sort of controversies when they appear in the articles. Having been through, my background is in humanities, is in English. So we didn't do a lot of, real research. We're reading poetry and we're telling you what it means. So, however, my doctorate is in adult learning and higher education. So there we do actual hardcore research. And so for the past few semesters, I've taken statistics courses, which I've never had to do before. I'm sure you guys taken a lot of statistics courses, right? And they were wonderful, I'm sure. Just as wonderful as mine were, I'm sure. But one of the things that made me more aware of is, finding, the gaps and the cracks in just about anything. You can find something wrong with just about any research that you look at. You can find something wrong with it. And that's not to say that what you're supposed to do in a lit review is find something wrong with everything, but it is a sense that, you want to look a little bit more deeply because you're knowledgeable now. You know how to read, statistical data. You know what a sample should be. You know what different kind of methods there are. So you want to look a little more deeply than you would have maybe before you were a doctoral student. So I can definitely sort of push you in that direction. So be a critical reader, and this is not in the packet that you guys have, but I'll make sure you guys get these slides as well. But basically, it's just what I said. So any research is bound to have flaws. It's going to have something wrong with it. It's where the problem is. It could be something that the author clearly acknowledges, and a lot of times they do, but it's going to be there. There's going to be some limitation, some flaw. And then sometimes there might be actual errors. So pay close attention to these particular areas. I think are probably the ones that are easiest to focus in on. Sampling is, what's the sample they're drawing from? Are there problems with the sample? What could be the problems with the sample? And of course, know how to read the statistical data. I don't know what kind of research packages, statistical packages that you guys use. We use SPSS. I don't know. Do you guys use SPSS and things like that? So know how to read the printout and know what looks like. Know what things may look fishy, based on that. Measurements. What are the measurements being used? How are they measuring it? Are there flaws to this measurement system? Maybe they're using multiple systems of measurement. Why have they chosen this particular system of measurement? Was there a certain kind of test or certain kinds of standards? So look into those sorts of things as far as methods of measurement. And problem identification. Have they focused on the right problem? Have they focused on an aspect of the problem that is researchable? Have they sort of gone through the process that you're going through, which is, what is the larger picture, and then where does that particular article fit in that? What piece do they provide of the puzzle, and is it the right piece? Are they trying to find the answers to the right questions based on the kind of experiment they did? and sometimes they're not. Maybe maybe you realize after reading the article, and they wouldn't admit to it because they spent all this time on it, that they should have been asking this question. They were asking this question because they got a different answer than they expected. And sometimes that can be in the conclusion of the article as well. But it's something worth pointing out. Thinking about other sources. Now, in addition to sort of going back to that empirical research, that's research. That's experimental, observational research, right? And that's really probably mostly what you guys are going to be using in a dissertation, I would guess. However, there are other sorts of research out there that you would be referring to. There'll be lit review articles, just like what you have. Yep.
We're not dissertation. We're all DMP students, and ours is a capstone project.
Oh, same thing. Same thing. Lit review, same thing. You're doing the same kind of research. But you'll be looking at lit review articles like the one that I provided for you guys. And I think I mentioned already. So don't be discouraged if you read a lit review article and they've done exactly what you were planning on doing, because you can use that to build on. They've already found a bunch of the sources. Check out those sources. I mean, you don't want to copy what they said about the sources, but use them as a guide to go into that and maybe to dig deeper and find a new angle on what's going on. Read their sources, but make the interpretation your own. And you might even, and you do want to acknowledge them in your research and say, in this such and such a journal, so and so did a literature review article on this subject, and pointed out these particular sources which state blah 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 according to this author. However, these are, I agree with this, or these things are agreed upon by this. And so things you agree with, things you disagree with, new angles, maybe areas of that you can advance it and go on from there. So you can use those sources is what I'm saying. Don't feel like that is something you can't use, but use it in a way that makes it your own. Anecdotal reports. A lot of times you'll be reading material based on anecdote, not based on actual research. And a lot of times this comes from sort of practitioner-oriented journals and publications. I know there's a lot of that in my field. Some of that can be really helpful, but it's not empirical research. It doesn't have methodology, that sort of thing. It's just this particular, incident happened, this particular case, this particular situation, which can be helpful, but it's something you can use, but you want to indicate that it is sort of anecdotal research. It's not empirical research. And reports on practices should be standards. Standards. I don't know what standards are, but I have standards. I don't know if I have standards. But reports on practices or standards, sometimes that's very helpful, especially in your all's field. It might be something that you're actually focusing on. Is a standard the correct standard? Should a standard be revised? Is a practice the correct practice? Should the practice be revised? And what sort of reports are out there from professional organizations, from the government, etc., on these practices and standards? That can be helpful in your lit review as well. All right. So we've figured out what we're going to research. We've looked at a bunch of stuff. We've sorted out what we need. We've critiqued it. We know what it says. So let's write the darn thing already. And I'm probably leaving out a step of the process that I actually do, which is, I'm not a terribly organized person, just by nature. I'm not. I'm very haphazard. I'm very sloppy. But over time, I've had to become organized in certain aspects of my life. And one of those aspects is research. I've had to come up with a system of how to organize my research. And it's been really, really helpful that I've come to you, if we sort of dissing technology here a minute ago because this wasn't working. But however, there are a lot of really good technological tools out there for helping you organize research. One I use one called Evernote. I don't know if you've ever heard of it before, but it's a program. It's you can use it web-based, so it's on the web. You can also download it to if you have a smartphone, you can put it on your phone, iPad, it's all those sorts of things. And there are a bunch of programs like that. But basically what it is, it's a program that helps you organize information into folders, put tags on it, be able to search your own information to find things. And what I've done basically with every research project I've probably done in the past 4 years at least, is I've created a folder, a big folder, and then within that They're like smaller subfolders that have articles and notes and etc. And they've got tags, which is basically like keywords that I've indicated with them that are on there. So that whenever I'm looking for something, I can pretty much go into Evernote, type in a keyword or two, and I can find what I'm looking for. Go, oh, what was that article that I had on blah, 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 and I can pull it up like that. And that's come in so handy just for so many different things. Saves so much time. But it's really helpful, I think, for writing lit reviews. So I've used it exclusively for writing lit reviews the past 2 semesters, as you can sort of put your sources in there, tag what's important, even put in chunks of your sources, especially if a lot of this stuff is now electronic, it's on PDFs and that sort of thing. You can actually put the PDF into Evernote, so it's actually there. So you have the whole article right there, and you can highlight things and have those in there. And so you can find what you're looking for, and then you just pull bits and pieces as you're putting your document together, and you can, organize it sort of as you go. And so sometimes I'll even, as I'm putting things into Evernote, I might write introduction, like as a keyword, because I'm thinking I'm going to use that in the introduction because I think that's an important thing. Or I'm going to definitely mention that in the conclusion. Or this has to do with this theme, this has to do with that theme, and indicate a keyword. So having some sort of system like that, and it can be a simple system too. Before I had Evernote, I just used Word, Microsoft Word, and I just used headings. And I just slapped things in there as I went, and then just sort of built my lit reviews and papers based on that. So you can do it with just simple word processing, but there are tools out there. So, but let's assume you've done your research, you've gotten it organized, you know what you're going to do. Then you have to worry about the format of an actual lit review. What does a lit review look like? Okay, well, you have an introduction. Okay, you introduce your reader to the topic, just like any other paper. You identify the topic, you give, what is this area, and you provide some sort of context for it, whether it is, maybe it's something that's important right now for some reason, maybe it's, particularly, newsworthy or important to the scientific area that you're in, or important to you in your field, but give some sort of context for how people are supposed to look at the literature. Point out the overall trends, so sort of general themes and what's going on in the topic. What are the main conflicts? What are the main methodologies? What sort of evidence and conclusions are out there? What are some gaps in the research or scholarship? Or maybe one single problem, if you're already getting focused in on that, and you'll focus on the single problem and then give sort of background and lead back up to it. So this is basically, you're providing an overview of where you're going to go for the whole paper. It's like the introduction, just like in any essay, introduction and lit review is kind of like a microcosm of the whole paper. So introduce the idea, give an overview of where you're going, and then give sort of the reason why. That be able to answer the so what question. What's your reason for writing this lit review? And another thing that I think is important is that sometimes you have to give some sort of explanation of why you're focusing on maybe a particular area of this problem that you are dealing with, or why your scope is a certain way. Maybe you're only focusing on research from a particular era in time, a certain time period. Maybe you're only focusing on research that pertains to a certain element of the problem. The example I'll give of that is the paper I had, the lit review I did last fall was on, I may have talked to you, some of you guys, because I think I've talked to you guys before about stuff. So I wrote a paper last fall about presidential decision-making in athletics. And it was related to sort of university presidents' decision-making related to athletic programs. And as I got into the research and I realized how big of a topic it was, I realized I was going to actually have to sort of focus down a little bit. So at first it was going to be about factors influencing presidential decision-making in athletic programs. And then I realized that there were way too many of those. So I was going to have to focus on specific types of factors or categories of factors. So I ended up focusing on internal factors, university internal factors related to presidential decision-making in athletics. But I had to explain that in my introduction, that basically the question was too big for me to take on everything. So I really had to focus down on what were just the internal factors related to make it something that was actually doable, to make it something that was going to be a good lit review. Or lead up to a good. I'm hoping that's going to be the lit review towards my. If my proposal is accepted, it's part of my dissertation. But anyway, so that's where I ended up. Is I had to give information on the scope as to why I focused in on that particular area of that particular problem. Taking on that problem, that particular area of that problem, and basically because it's just basically too big to take on that whole big area. I can deal with this one small area and find out something meaningful about that. The body, writing the body, you should. Look for themes in the literature organized by types of the study, group research studies, and other types of literature. So the research here, case studies. There's the paper that I gave you guys as an example, the Gender Discrimination in Nursing Lit Review. They do this kind of, that they give, they do their introduction there on page 59. Then they start their literature review. Then notice they break it down into case studies, specific case studies. So they give some background information, some background studies, and then they go to specific case studies. So they've organized it by that, which is an interesting way to do it. So, and then they go on to, at the end, they do a section on limitations and then specifically counteracting gender discrimination. So that's how they've organized it. They've got specific types, which are case studies, then on a specific effect that they want to produce, which is counteracting the discrimination. So you can think about your organization, and that's a helpful way to write the paper too, I think, is that if you come up with those, you've done the research, you've done the reading, you can come up probably within your head, well, most of my research sort of talks about this or mentions this as a major theme. So that becomes a heading. And you put all that stuff under there, right? And then this is another idea, and this becomes a heading. And then there's also a lot of stuff that's this kind of research that doesn't really fit anywhere else. I'm going to put it right here. So you can figure out ways to organize things that make sense. And it makes sense to you. And then the trick, though, is to make sure that it makes sense to the reader as well. And that's where a lot of times you do have to, I talk about a lot about APA, and I say that APA really lets you off the hook as far as having transitions and making a smooth and graceful flow from one paragraph to the other. But in a lit review, sometimes you have to provide those connections between ideas, or it doesn't make any sense. Why are you going to case studies here? Well, I have to provide a transition and explain why I'm going to case studies here. So in the body, along with the organizational issues, you summarize individual studies or articles with as much or little detail as each merits according to its comparative importance in the literature. Remembering, I think I mentioned this to you guys a few minutes ago, remembering that space denotes significance. And this is something that I've had trouble with, because you're just going to find that there's more research in particular areas than in others. And you're going to find those sources easier to find sometimes, and maybe even easier to understand or critique. And you're going to maybe write a lot about those, and then realize that those really aren't as important as this smaller group of studies. But what happens in the lit review then is that somebody reads 4 or 5 pages of this one thing, and then they get a page of this other thing that's really more important. And it throws it off balance, is what I'm saying. Is that it also misleads the reader into thinking that this one thing is very important, this thing is not as important. So you have to think about space is importance. So, so sometimes that leads to cutting things. That you go, well, I read that and it's really good, but you think about it, is it really necessary for my reader to understand where I'm going with this, to know about all there is to know about this little area, when really the most important thing is this thing. So you have to think about that and maybe cut pieces. I had the lit review I wrote this past semester, which I'm fast forgetting, trying to forget. Was an information technology lit review related to tutoring, which is I run the tutoring center, and I had a really, really, really long section about course management systems and what they could do, blah, 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 blah. But that really, as it turns out, it really wasn't that important to what I was trying to say in the paper, because I was really trying to focus on synchronous. I'm getting way off topic here. I was trying to focus on real-time tutoring. And course management systems only allow asynchronous tutoring, like discussion boards and things like that. But I had like 5 or 6 pages of the stuff on discussion boards and blah, blah, blah. And then, so it looked like that was really important, but it's not. Plus, it was turning into like a 30-page paper, and it was supposed to be only 20 pages long. So, axe that part. So, there you go. It still was 26 pages. Was it 20? Yeah, it was turning a 30-page paper. I think I ended up with 39 pages when I finished my draft, and I got it down to 25, I think. So, but then again, I'm an English teacher person, and I write a lot, talk a lot. So maybe not everybody has that problem. Another thing about the body, provide the reader with strong umbrella sentences at the beginning of paragraphs, signposts throughout, brief so what summary sentences at intermediate points in the review to aid in understanding, comparison, and analyses. You have to let your reader know where you're going with things. Again, it's sort of like I said about flow and linkage and that sort of thing, that a lot of sort of basic research writing in APA, you don't necessarily have to have that if you're just giving, the results of, observational research, empirical research. But if you're doing a lit review, you have to connect these ideas, and you have to remind your reader why this is important. This study is important because of these factors, so they don't get lost along the way in the detail that you're giving them. Working with your sources, it can become like an avalanche if you're not careful. Because with a project like a literature review, you're just getting so much stuff. And you just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, and it's easy to drown in it. And one of the ways that you can drown in it is become too reliant on it and not on your own brain. So one of the things that I always teach when I teach just basic research writing in freshman composition is I tell my writers, read your sources, and this is for like a 8-page research paper, so it's no big deal, right? So read your sources. I give them, we do what's called a discovery draft. Read your sources. I give them about 15 minutes to sort of review their sources they've supposedly already read, right? And then I said, put it away, and now I want you to write for 45 minutes on what your sources said. Because there's a tendency, if you're either done a whole lot of research or you're on the other side and you're really uncomfortable with the material and haven't mastered it, to rely too much on it and to basically sound like your source material instead of sounding like you delivering the information. So you want to be the reader to be aware all the time that you are the writer that's talking to them. I mean, you're talking to them in your professional voice, it's a formal voice, but it's still your research writing voice. So you're connecting everything back to your focus, to your concerns, to how you contextualize and prioritize things. You need to be providing those connections throughout, along with whatever you give in terms of your source material. So you're summarizing or you're detailing or you're critiquing an article, but you need to make sure that the reader understands how that connects back to what you think is important at all times. So that you're just, the danger in a lit review is it can sometimes just sound like a string of article summaries. And that's what you don't want it to sound like. I would compare it to, I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but I'm a musician, and I always say that one of the great things about great bands is that you could take every little piece of instrumentation in a song, and if you stripped away everything else, you would know what that song was. Like you could take a Beatles song, and you could take away the guitars and the bass and the vocals and whatever, but if you just had the drums, if you just had Ringo and drums, you could probably tell what that song was. Just by the drum beat, because of the way he played, right? And so the same thing goes, I think, with research writing, is that you want to inject your own focus all the time to where it comes back, and that anybody reading just one page of your lit review is going to understand that it pertains to what your focus is, that it's not just a generic piece of writing. So it's all about contextualizing, providing that context, providing those connections all the time. and making those relationships clear between ideas and between the different works that you're looking at. Ways that you can, sort of craft your sources and include your sources, identifying new ways to interpret and shed light on gaps in previous research. Like I said, a lot of this stuff, this ground is going to have been covered before, but find new ways to look at it and new ways that it connects to what is concerning you right now or your field or your profession today. You can focus on resolving conflicts between different studies. Why does this study say this and this study say that? Well, it could be that this is the case, and maybe that's relevant to where you're going in the in your research. And also make sure that you make the connections to why new research is important. Why aren't these sources that you found necessarily conclusive or necessarily enough to get the job done? If you talk about how great this, you're not going to say great because you're writing in a research style, but you're talking about how important this particular research is, and these statistics show this and this and this and this and this. You also want to indicate why that either is something that needs to be built upon, or something that needs to be clarified, or something that can be taken further. So you always want to be going back to why what you're doing is important as well. In your conclusion, you go back and, like I said, like the introduction is a microcosm. Your conclusion is kind of a microcosm as well of your whole paper, but sort of leaving your reader with a sense of where to go next or what the next step is. So summarize the major contributions from the studies that you've looked at. You make sure you make that linkage back to your introduction as well. I always like to have that. I used to use a circle when I explain that in for basic composition classes. That a lot of ways a good essay is like a circle. Is that you start here and then you travel through here and then you come back to this point. And that's where your conclusion should reflect back on where you were at the beginning and remind your reader of what the essential purpose was. Evaluating the current state of the art of the body of knowledge reviewed, pointing out major methodological flaws or gaps in research, inconsistencies in theories and findings, areas or issues pertinent to future study. So basically like a greatest hits of your critiques that you've done in the body. So what were the big holes that you found in the literature that you presented in the body? And finally, a good way to conclude is provide some insight into the relationship between the central topic of the lit review and the larger area. Basically, again, answering, like you did in the introduction, the so what question. Why is this important? Why is this important to our understanding of this particular area of knowledge, this particular practice that we're involved in, etc.? Other concerns, some instructors may want you to write an abstract for the lit review. Not always is that the case. That was one of the reasons I included the little article here so you can see what a lit review abstract looks like. But basically like it is, about 120 words summary of the material there. And then of course the length of the lit review and required number of sources will vary based on what you're asked to do. So what's expected in a dissertation is probably going to be different than maybe what's accepted for a capstone. The way I understand the capstone is kind of between a thesis and a dissertation. It's sort of somewhere in between. And is it more practice focused? Yeah, it's more practice focused. So, you apply those sort of guidelines to what you're doing and keep those things in mind. And then, of course, I provide the example for you guys to take a look at. One of the things, though, I don't want you guys to get confused about is if you look at the references, they don't exactly look like regular APA style. But you guys are probably used to that by now because most journals have their own way of doing things. They want to change it up. So don't get confused. But the references and resources that I think are good. I mean, I included the dissertations and theses from start to finish, which like I said, I haven't read the second edition, but I used to use the first edition, which was 1993, I believe. And then this is a really, really cool book that one of my friends who just completed her dissertation recommended, The Dissertation Journey. So we could call it the Capstone Project Journey as well, but it's a similar thing. So, and of course, the APA manual is something that if you haven't already memorized it and lodged it into your brain permanently, then it'll probably happen before too long. So.